Okay, and we're recording. Welcome to this week's Cluster API breakout session. It is November 22nd on Wednesday. Let's get started. So according to our agenda, I had the first item. I don't know if the people here who have attended this meeting are particularly interested in this item. I'll throw it out there and see what people think about it. So in the machines API, and in particular where it crosses over with the cluster API, we have kind of an interesting, I don't know if I want to call it a wart, but maybe a temporary placeholder. So in order to define the version of the control plane that you want to run and give users enough control to write interesting software on top of this API, we've broken that out on a per machine basis. So if you're running in an HA mode, rather than have this global singleton of here is the version of the control plane I'm running, and anytime I change it, all of my masters update all at once, we've actually added this to the machines API as part of the spec as an optional field that is only set if the machine is a master and is ignored if the machine is a node or is in error state, a little unclear. So each individual machine that is a master can have in its spec the version of the control plane that should be running on that master, and that lets you do a slow controlled rollout, upgrade one master, make sure that it becomes healthy before you move on to the next one, et cetera. So that's already there. What's interesting is that this is one of the few fields that you can't easily check from the machine status. So the machine status has an object ref to the node that fulfills the machine, and every other field has some representation in the node spec or status, the version of the kubelet, the container runtime, all these other things. You can just look at the object in the API server. But if you want to check the version of the control plane that's actually running as opposed to what you've declared to be running, you actually need to connect directly to that machine. Find the node identity, connect directly to the API server running on that machine and ask it for its version, which means you have to start a new client and maybe do auth a little bit differently. So it's a little wonky. And it is achievable today if you care, if you're writing an upgrade tool and you say, I want to upgrade that master, and then wait to make sure that it finally gets reconciled and it reports that it's running the new version. But it's also something we could just bubble up to be part of the machine status itself. And so we can have a controller responsible for that writes in the machine status, and then a client doesn't actually have to worry about that logic. They just look at a field in the status. So there were a few people that might have been interested in this. I don't know if anyone has anyone on the call right now has any feedback on that pattern, if we do want this to be part of the status, or if it's okay for clients to have to kind of jump through hoops to figure out if this has been reconciled yet. And if there's complete crickets, we can just move on to the next item. But if anyone has comments, let me know.
Well, I have one comment, and that is the fact that currently we have distinction between masters and nodes, and in most cases there might be a mixture between both of those, and in some cases, like what we're currently doing, we don't even have master nodes, we only have worker nodes. So can this be used for example, for the for the kubelet versions and some other components, or it's only specific for the master nodes?
Yeah, so we could. So I'll say the way that you can get that right now is that is part of it's either the node spec or status. It is there right now because you can, like when you say kubectl get nodes, it knows the version of the kubelet that's running, and I believe it also reports the container runtime. So what you can do is get the machine object, look at its status, find the node ref, and then read that, and then find where that parameter should be to see. But to make it even easier on clients, for everything that we set in our spec, we can also auto-populate in the status and say, here's the kubelet version. So you don't even have to traverse nodes or traverse objects to get the node and know exactly where to look for it. You just only really have to interact with the machine. And I think that's a fine pattern as well. We've talked about that in the past. So are there particular fields that you care about having solid representation in the status as like a first-class citizen instead of having to traverse to the node?
I don't know. I mean, it's kind of tricky because in some situations you also have to synchronize, for example, the kubelet. If you run it with self-hosting, it can change at any point. So this is kind of like a tricky moment as well. So you also have to synchronize the version of the node and then the status of if you do self-hosting.
Got it. Okay. Anyone else thoughts on this particular issue? Otherwise, if it's not a hot topic, we can move on.
Just that it sounds like a good idea, and anything to avoid client complexity seems like a good idea.
I had one question about this. So what I understood was that you have the control plane as an optional sort of part in the machine spec, and then that gets applied to the master node. Like, is the sync process always like unidirectional? That whatever you see in the machine spec, it gets applied, but like user can always log into the machine directly and do stuff. Or you may have unattended upgrade on, and that basically upgrades your kubelet or whatnot.
Yeah. So the pattern that we're using with machines is, if you can think about the fact that today nodes are just not declarative, they're pretty much only the status. It's just whatever the kubelet is reported. You can look at the entire node and think of that as the status field of a super object, where the entire specification comes from the master. So the master, or sorry, not the master, the machine object. So the machine, everything in its spec is the authority of what you want that node to look like. And so whether the VM came up with incorrect settings, or whether someone logged into it and manually messed with things, the controller that's responsible for rectifying machines, which right now we have a machine controller, is constantly analyzing the actual state of the world versus the spec, and the spec always wins. So if it notices that the node that is supposed to be fulfilling this contract no longer matches what the spec is, it's up to the machine controller to either do an in-place upgrade or in-place swap, or completely delete and recreate the VM in order to make it so. So we always consider whatever's in the machine to be the authority.
Okay, so there was one issue regarding this before when I'm using kubeadm, is that the node object does not report back the kubeadmin version. And the kubeadmin version is important to do the upgrades and all that sort of stuff. So how are you doing that?
Interesting. So yeah, so right now, the way we frame this is we try to keep the API as deployment agnostic as possible. And so
right. Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, this is like a real problem though, right? Because like you need the because the kubeadmin sort of actually is important to know, like if you want to upgrade or do any, like which version gets installed, like it's sort of, you need to keep that in sync, right? Because kubeadmin will only let you update like a minor version or a patch version, things like that.
Sure. So let me just summarize like the current state of the world, and if there's a better way of doing it, love to hear the feedback. So the API is, as it is deployment agnostic, but the tool that you use to actually create the cluster that supports the API and sets up the proper controllers can do anything it needs to under the covers to maintain its own state, to do additional checks if necessary in order to fulfill the contract of the API. So in our reference implementation, we have a prototype right now that works against GCE. We do use kubeadmin for initializing the control plane and bringing up nodes. We don't explicitly track the version of kubeadmin that we want, but we figure out what version that we need based off of the rest of the settings. So looking at the version of the kubelet that you have and the version of the kubelet that you want and the version of the control plane that you want, we can determine what version of kubeadmin to use. Now, if it's so there's other state that we want to keep track of as an implementation detail as part of this implementation. So what we do is add annotations to objects, which are completely freeform, and anyone can add whatever annotations. So we just have some special annotations that represent the state that we want to capture. Like when we create a VM, we add some annotations so we remember exactly where we created that VM. So later when we want to delete it, we remember exactly project zone name, where we created it, things like that. So what you could do is, but this entire pattern allows someone else to write a different cluster management tool that doesn't use kubeadm at all. And so it doesn't really need a first-class high-level representation of kubeadmin's version as a declarative part of the state or tracking purposes. So if you do want to track that, you could add that as an annotation. You could add it as
sorry to cut you. But yeah, so the issue the last time I was working on this, the issue was that like knowing the version of kubeadmin was a problem, because like right now nobody reports it from inside, right? Like because I was told that the kubelet is not going to report that because it's like a layering violation, because kubelet should not know about kubeadmin or anything else that sort of provisions it. So then the way I understand, the machine controller also doesn't have any idea what's running on the machine. So what I was doing at the point was basically run like a daemon set, which will periodically check the kubeadm version, and then like basically annotate the node object for itself to sort of just so that we can keep track. Because if user, I mean, I'm just trying to understand. I understand the overall architecture, why this is like should be like an implementation detail, but I'm just trying to understand like if you are using kubeadmin, then how sort of this issue, like the idea of using a demo set feels pretty hacky to me right now, but I don't see any alternative option.
Yeah. So I have two things to say. One thing I strictly disagree with, which is actually, I do expect a fairly tight coupling between the mechanism used for installation and the mechanism used for reconciliation. So the installer that you use needs to be fully aware of the machine controller and all of its implementation details, and they should stay in sync. So one of the things that we do right now is during installation, we create the initial master VM, but as part of our, if we wanted to start up clusters very quickly, instead of waiting for the machine controller to start and reconcile the other VMs that you have to define your cluster, the installer could do all of that in parallel even before the control plane comes up. And in order to do that correctly so that the machine controller can still reconcile state of those machines that are created, it should make sure that it's creating machines the exact same way that the machine controller is going to. And so they can share implementation details between them, and they really should be consistent between them. So that's one thing. The other thing is, from a client's perspective, if you are integrating on top of the Machines API and on top of the Cluster API, having to know that the cluster even uses kubeadmin, I think is an anti-pattern. And if you have to worry about what version it's using, I'm going to assume that one of the problems you might be hitting is saying things like, I'm running, the cluster is running 1.5, like the control plane is 1.5, all my kubelets are 1.5. I cannot actually go directly to 1.8. I should use a much safer upgrade strategy. And what we're saying as part of the Cluster API is it is completely fine to say my entire cluster is running 1.5, and now in a declarative way, I want to say I want it to be running 1.8.0, and the implementation underneath that should know the safe strategy to get there. So as a client on top of the Cluster API, I just say I want it to be this version, and the machine controller and any other controllers that you install in the cluster as part of the cluster setup should know how to get safely from point A to B, or should report an error saying, sorry, I can't handle that. You don't have to support every arbitrary combination of going from one version to another version, upgrade, downgrade. You can just say, sorry, I don't support that, set an error. But if it does fulfill that, it should know how to do it in a safe way. So it should take care of, I know how to get from 1.5 to 1.6, and then, okay, I'm checkpointing, I'm at 1.6 now, and I'm going to go from 1.6 to 1.7, et cetera, and do that completely under the covers, which gives the client on top of the Cluster API a lot better UX without having to worry about all those details.
One part I'm sort of still maybe I'm not fully understanding the like the implementation or the sort of the design. So the machine controller is just like any other controller in the Kubernetes cluster, right? It's not running on every machine. It just watches the machine objects and like does what it needs to do, right?
But it does.
But does it have like direct access to the machine? In so can it install kubelet, or is it like basically brings up a VM with like the proper startup script so that the kubelet is there? Like what?
It can actually do both. So not only is it responsible for creating the VMs, which means that it has full control over what their boot up script should be, which means it's going to have to feed the correct data through the VM metadata, and then make sure it does a template or whatever to make sure it gets the right version of things for bootstrapping purposes. But one of the things that we've done in order to support in-place upgrades, and I wish Fung was on the call, I don't think he is because he did a lot of work for this, is actually have a mechanism to call out to other VMs. And I think he's just using SSH now. But it could be some other agent that we install to allow some sort of remote command, or it could be something like a daemon set to run directly on each host. But we are actually still running a centralized machine controller. But if we detect that we're able to do an in-place upgrade, like we can do an in-place upgrade of the kubelet or use kubeadmin upgrade to upgrade the control plane, it does an on-demand SSH to that machine. And it knows that it can because it's fully responsible for creating the VM in the first place. So it knows that that VM should have SSH, and it should set it up in such a way that it has credentials to SSH there. But the fact that it uses SSH is implementation detail. We can swap that out for something else. But it does do on-demand pushes, which means that it could on-demand ask that host, tell me if it's an Ubuntu host, use apt-get to show me every package I have on the system, so I can do more client side or in the controller to figure out what to do. Instead of just pushing commands, it can also retrieve data if it needs to.
Okay, I understand. Thanks.
Sure. Okay, so we had a little bit of digression there, but it's totally interesting, and I love talking through the different patterns that you can use with the API, because I think it's so powerful that you could have completely different implementations that still make the API useful, because as a user on top of the API, you just say, hey, I want to run this new version. And I think that's really cool. Okay, any other thoughts on this particular topic? I'll write down notes afterward before we move on to the next one. Cool, okay.
Okay, so the next thing is there is a KubeCon that is coming up in Austin, I think. And we are already late for this, but next one is in Copenhagen in next year in May, I think. And they have already opened the proposals for sessions, and we can explore this, I guess, and also a possible meetup. So your thoughts about this?
Very cool. I know that Robert Bailey from our side, from Google, and Chris Nova from Microsoft are going to present at least what we've done so far with the Cluster API at this coming KubeCon, which I think is in Austin. And so I'm not sure, does anyone else, because I know a lot of other people have now expressed interest after we've gotten the prototype moving and have more solid ideas of what we're doing. Does anyone else have ideas of things that they want to build using the Cluster API, or do they want to integrate the Cluster Machines API into existing cluster controllers, like or cluster setup tools, or other projects that they think are on top of just the fact that we're doing the Cluster API itself? Or do we just want to do like another status report because it's after this KubeCon of, hey, we've made this much progress, it's this much more useful?
I'm really interested in understanding using the Cluster API with Packet, which is where I am at. We've been working with various people doing setup tools to understand their plans for using the Cluster API, and I think it would simplify our engagement strategy if everyone was using a similar API rather than 5 or 6 different people singing the same tune. So yeah, the interest is in understanding what the standardization is, and even if it's not ready yet, getting involved in the process.
Oh yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm hoping that this, or I don't know how many people have context on this. I believe Packet is purely bare metal, but gives you kind of a cloud-like interface on top of it for remote management. Is that somewhat fair to say? I don't know how dynamically scalable it is, but at least gives you nice remote management of bare metal. Yeah,
so it's cloud, without going into a sales pitch, it's bare metal servers. So once you get one, it's your own server. We do a provisioning step, which is currently somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes to go from bare metal to a login prompt. We think that the improvements that Google has made in the BIOS world will eventually trickle up into faster boot times, but that's a side issue. And then once you've got a machine provisioned, we've got full control through an API for things like rebooting it or destroying it or or if you want to scale up, starting another one. We support Ansible and Terraform right now for the sort of people building machines. And we've been working with Kubicorn, kubeadm, Farmer, and a few others. I don't have the complete list. Just tried to look at the scope of what people are actually doing now. KubeSpray, I think, is in that list too. There's a list. It keeps growing as you discover new ones. To get involved with people as we understand what does it take to spin things up. The other potentially complicating or more interesting factor is that in addition to Intel-based servers, Packet supports ARM-based servers. So I'm very interested in the work that Lucas is doing in the ARM world, and he's got Kubernetes stuff running in our cluster. We have a works on ARM cluster with some number of dozens of machines available for access to people doing ARM-based projects.
Very cool. Yeah, and so a question that comes up a lot when we talk about cluster lifecycle, and especially cluster API, machines API, is how is this going to work well with on-premise or even bare metal machines? And so having maybe not production worthy, but at least a reference implementation of here's how you can do it using the Packet APIs, I think would go a long way to proving out these ideas or finding even more edge cases that we've missed in the initial API design that we need to account for. So that's really what we should work together to figure that out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the API that we expose is complete enough that that it's and similar enough to some other providers that are also doing either VMs or bare metal, but different from the largest providers in the world to be an interesting, like if you're going to do things 3 times to say that you've done it, something like Packet is probably one of those 3 times.
Got it. Cool. So back to the original item, I'll throw it back to Martin. Were there ideas you had for KubeCon or things that you would want to see presented there, even if you didn't work on them personally? Like a call to action of this group?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, just to get the community to know. I mean, right now with the current KubeCon, we show the initial prototype and the initial API, but I hope that later on, in May, we can actually show from different vendors or on different platforms, etc. So it can show much growth and collaboration. So hopefully more people will join this working group and start using this. So yeah. I'll try to submit some sessions. I'm not sure they will be related to the machine API, and we'll see.
Cool. Yeah, sounds good. And we don't have an official working group for this. We're still kind of a spin-off of Cluster Lifecycle, but if anyone has ideas or is looking for co-presenters or anything, a great place to coordinate is either this meeting or just the Cluster Lifecycle mailing list. Feel free to reach out if you have an idea or you have a half-baked idea or you have an idea that you don't have enough time to prepare for and you're looking for someone else to be inspired by your idea. Cool. So that's actually it on the agenda for today. Does anyone else want to add anything ad hoc that they want to discuss?
Yeah, I only have 2 things. I mean, last time we discussed about Kube node set. I think 2 days ago, there's an article on the news deck which described it also more in detail. So if you're interested in it, we're currently also looking into Cluster API, of course, and probably on KubeCon we can also discuss where are potential points or what's the best way to integrate or to join efforts, because of course we don't want to build a similar thing again. The other thing is we will have before the KubeCon there's a meetup from I think Huawei, VMware. We are doing it, and we do a talk about Kube node set there. So if someone is interested in it and is in Austin, yeah, feel free to join. And then we can also discuss about our ideas and where we want to go with it. And yeah, of course, currently, as I said, main intention is work closely with you guys to integrate this and get something done together.
Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah, that was it from my side.
Sure, sure. I've been making my way through. I had done a first pass on KubeNode and the node set and Archon a while ago, and I've been looking at recent updates and attempting to take a fresh look at how can we merge the projects or have them be a better together kind of scenario. And I still don't have a clear picture. So if you have any thoughts coming from the other side, more than happy to hear. But I think I'm personally still trying to wrangle the two ideas.
Same from our side. So currently looking into it, what's the best way, and probably where we need enhancements. So are you around at KubeCon?
This year in Austin, I have a personal conflict. I won't be able to make it.
Okay.
The rest of my team from Google will be there, so there'll be plenty of people to talk to. And like I said, Robbie's giving a presentation specifically on the Cluster API, but I personally won't be around.
Okay. Yeah, probably I will catch up with some other guys there, or probably we can set up a separate meeting where we can discuss in detail, okay, what could be potential ways how to integrate this, or how to get both things together.
Sounds good, yeah.
Perfect.
Cool. So we're only at the halfway point. If there's nothing else to discuss, we can call it early. I know in America we have Thanksgiving tomorrow, so attendance is a little spotty this week, and probably a lot of people are happy to get to their long weekend. But anything else before we shut it out? Okay, thanks, guys. I'll post the recording later on, but I think we have another meeting next week. I'll see you all then. Maybe we'll have even more thoughts on how to merge the two products together or how to work better together. But otherwise, see you guys next week.
Bye-bye.